Just when things seemed like they had settled down, the wild ride on Wall Street cranked up again on Thursday. Bad economic reports and continuing fears over Europe's debt crisis triggered a new sell-off that started early in the day and lasted until the closing bell. When the dust settled, the Dow Jones had lost 419 points that erased much of the gains that were made over the last 5 days. For more insight on what's happening on Wall Street and the economy at large, we're joined by Rick Newman. He's the chief business correspondent for U.S. News and World Report. Rick, good morning to you. Good to have you. All right, so when we looked at things earlier this week, it looked like the markets were stabilizing. What happened?
The big concern now is really Europe more than the United States. We've got this debt problem over there with the countries we keep hearing about, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and now the worries are it's spreading to bigger countries like Italy. The problem is that this affects the whole banking sector in Europe, and they just don't have a solution for it. Right. These governments all have too much debt. We think politics here is fractured and dysfunctional. It's even worse in Europe because there is no central government that governs these 17 countries that are in the Eurozone.
Is this country and Europeans, or the European economy, are those both at risk of recession?
Absolutely. And one of the reasons the markets have been nosediving for the last couple of weeks is that the markets are finally saying, holy cow, we now need to account for the possibility of another recession. Now, people don't need to panic right now. I mean, economists are saying things like the chance of another recession might be something like 40%, maybe 50%. But this is the dreaded double dip scenario. And it means that instead of, the unemployment rate going down and us getting comfortable with job security again and things like that, we may go through this thing all over again.
And you hear the doom and gloom, and you don't hear any good prognostications at this point, but is there anything to stop it?
Yes, there is. First of all, a lot of things are not as bad as they were in 2008. So we're not looking at necessarily another huge replay of that horror show. For instance, companies are in far better shape, big companies especially right now. They've got a lot of cash on their books. They've laid off so many people, they almost can't lay off anybody else. So we're very unlikely to see the huge numbers of layoffs we saw 3 years ago. The banking system's in better shape. We're not probably going to have a credit crunch or a credit freeze really like we had in 2008. And it's very important to point out that Washington, the politicians in Washington, could do a number of things to make this better. There are a lot of different ideas for how to get the deficit and the debt problem under control and still come out and do a few things to help the economy without making that worse. It's tricky, it's not easy, but the ideas are there. It's certainly not rocket science. The politicians can't agree on how to do it. That's the problem. It is a political problem. It is not a lack of ideas. It's not a lack of solutions. It's a lack of political will.
While you're talking about Washington, let's talk about the Justice Department's investigation into Standard & Poor's. They want to see if there was any manipulation in the ratings of mortgage-backed securities, especially in the lead-up to the financial meltdown. If they find out that there were, what does that mean for S&P?
Well, this is a complicated thing that goes all the way back to 2005, 2006, and that whole subprime crisis that led to the recession. S&P and the other rating agencies were clearly wrong when they gave a AAA rating, which is their highest rating, to some of those securities that ended up being so-called toxic securities that lost so much money. They were obviously wrong. The question is, were they just wrong, or were they negligent or somehow legally liable, or did they manipulate their own ratings for some kind of profit to them? And the problem is there's a conflict of interest built into this whole system. Without getting too arcane, the rating agencies get paid by the firms whose securities they rate. So there's an incentive for them to give a higher rating in order to get more business from those firms. There's no evidence that has happened, but I think that's what the Justice Department is trying to figure out. Can they make a case that is actually what happened?
When I first heard that S&P was being investigated, the first thing that I thought was the back down or the downgraded U.S. economy credit rating. Are those two events connected somehow?
You can't overlook the timing of this, can you?
Right.
I think it's very unlikely that they're related. I mean, these concerns about S&P and the other rating agencies, Moody's and Fitch, this goes back for a couple of years. The government has supposedly been looking into this. And by the way, the government hasn't announced that it's pressing charges or anything like that. This was leaked news that they're just looking into whether they have a case. Right. So they could very well conclude that we don't have a case. They never press charges, nothing ever happens. Or they could pull off some kind of settlement with S&P. I mean, we really don't know, and they're just not saying.
Rick Newman of U.S. News and World Report, we appreciate you having the insight and bringing it to us this morning on the show.
Thanks for having me.